Welcome you all to the 2023 Project Canopy grant training. Thank you for taking the time and navigating any IT issues you might have had on your end, and bearing with us as we work through any that we have on ours. So my name is Jan Santerre. I'm the Project Canopy coordinator for the Maine Forest Service, and joining me online and to help in the presentation is Marlene LaJoy. She is the MFS resource administrator and our MFS grant guru. There, she's on camera there, so you can see her too. And also Kim Ballard is joining us. I believe I saw her name online. Kim is our outreach coordinator. Hi, Kim. Outreach and partnership coordinator with Project Canopy. So she is a resource to you as well. She won't be doing any of the presentation today, but just know that she is a resource, and her contact information is listed in the grant guidelines. And then we also have with us Greg Lord. Greg Lord is the senior planner with me here at the Maine Forest Service, and he is helping us with the IT stuff. If you have any issues with hearing, seeing anything, you can reach out to him, email him. He's hanging out in the background to deal with any of that stuff. And as people pop in here, forgive me for pausing for just a moment while we just make sure everybody's in the presentation and able to participate. I think, I don't know if you can unmute yourself at the end. We'll wait. You can pop your questions in the chat. You can always raise your hand and we can unmute you that way. And then at the end, we can unmute everybody and allow you to ask your questions at that time. But in the interest of time, we've got 80 slides to get through. It's not the most invigorating of material, but it is informative, and it will help you to understand whether or not your organization is eligible to apply to this program, whether what you want to do is an eligible activity under this program, and it will help you navigate a lot of the financial perils that can come with accepting federal grants. So we're going to run through this in kind of 3 sections. I'm going to do a quick overview of Project Canopy and our 23 assistance grants program. And then we're going to follow that by the grant guidelines and application procedures. And then Marlene's going to go over in detail the rules of the road for these grants. So again, forgive me, I got stuff popping up on my screen, which is why I keep pausing. Hoping, all right. Letting a couple of people in here. Okay. So Marlene will cover much of what is and isn't eligible, and there are some very distinct things that cannot be covered by these grants. So those are important things to understand. Then we'll wrap up and we can address your questions and have a conversation. Oftentimes those conversations are very helpful in helping others that are interested in applying to know just more about the program generally, and to help flesh out ideas too. So we've already done the introductions, so we'll move right on. First off, what is Project Canopy? Project Canopy is the state of Maine's urban and community forestry program. It's a program of the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry's Maine Forest Service. The program was designed to educate people about the benefits of trees and to assist in providing expertise to towns and communities with their community tree and forest resources. The program in its current form was initiated in 1990, though Maine's shade tree program more officially dates back to the 1970s and even earlier. What do we do? So we work on a variety of projects, including some of the more fun ones, like the Maine Register of Big Trees. We administer the Tree City USA program. Kim works on newsletters. We do Arbor Day celebrations and celebrating our communities and their community tree achievements. But primarily what we focus on is providing technical assistance and educational assistance to the cities and towns across the state. Our objective is to help towns and communities throughout Maine to develop and maintain long-term community forestry plans in order to maximize the benefits that trees and forests provide. We do that through a variety of means. Again, technical assistance is one of those primary services that MFS and Project Canopy provide to communities and professionals. Our staff, which includes myself and Kim, as well as our currently 10 district foresters, we offer hands-on technical assistance, educational programming, training sessions, and workshops throughout the year to communities and organizations that make those requests. We provide financial assistance to municipalities, educational institutions, and nonprofit groups developing and implementing community forestry projects and programs through the through the Project Canopy Community Forestry Assistance Program. And that is what you are here to learn about today. So for this year, 2023, how much do we have available? 200,000 is what we are approximating we have available in our core Project Canopy assistance funds. These available grants have been divided into 2 grant categories to address different objectives that you may have. The first and most straightforward grant program is the planting and maintenance grant category that covers planting, tree maintenance, and removal. The maximum award for this grant category is $10,000. And for those of you who may have participated in this program in the past and are here to just do a refresher, you'll recognize that that is a slight increase from the maximum that was allowed previously. And again, the second category is planning and education, and that maximum has been increased as well. So we're up to $12,000 award maximum in the planning and education grant category, which focuses on sustainable community forest management and efforts to increase the awareness of the benefits of trees and forests provide. So a few grant basics. Who's eligible? I've already mentioned grants are available to state, county, and municipal governments, primarily to municipal governments, as well as educational institutions and nonprofit organizations. Public access is a key with any of these grants. Trees must be planted on public property or on property with free public access that is visible from or contiguous to transportation corridors or other public spaces. How much is available? We can match 50% of your expenditures, including purchase and planting of trees and maintenance during the grant period, fees charged by contractors, site preparation costs, and the purchase of essential supplies and materials. Marlene, again, will go into much more detail about what we can and cannot cover, particularly among that supplies and materials line. It's important to note that there's a signed agreement between the grantee representing the municipality, educational institution, or nonprofit, and the State Department of Ag, Conservation, and Forestry. After grants are awarded, work can begin once that agreement is signed by all parties. When can the work be done? It depends on the grant category when the work can be done to an extent. For planting and maintenance grants, the planting and or maintenance must be completed within 12 months of the grant award. So you have a year from that start date, roughly. For planning and education, recognizing that these are a little bit more involved and oftentimes involve working with consultants and other outside contractors. We give you a bit more time. So the grant timeline for planning and education is 18 months. And another key component of this grant program, which a lot of folks don't understand when they get into it, this is reimbursement-based funding. So once grants are awarded, recipients are reimbursed for satisfactory work completed within the grant period, as described in the original scope of work. Grant funds are not provided up front. Final receipt for reimbursement must be submitted along with verification of all matching and in-kind expenses. So the entity receiving the grant will have to bear the costs until that reimbursement is complete. So the funds for Project Canopy grants come from the USDA Forest Service Community Forestry Assistance Program. The USDA Forest Service Urban and Community Forestry Program was authorized by the Cooperative Forestry Assistance Act of 1978 and revised by the 1990 Farm Bill to promote natural resource management in populated areas, recognizing the importance of trees in improving quality of life. We do have some additional funding in this program that's provided through funds collected related to enforcement action in support of tree planting in specific areas of the state, and through other grant funds with specialized purposes, such as for planning and response to invasive forest pests, including the emerald ash borer. The purpose of the grants is to support community efforts to develop and maintain long-term community forestry programs by raising public awareness, developing and maintaining partnerships, promoting comprehensive natural resource management, and increasing the number of what we call actively managing communities in the state. And what do we mean by actively managing? So as with any program that's funded by the federal government, we have standards that we have to report on annually. And for the Urban and Community Forestry Program, we report on communities that possess these characteristics that we together compile what would be an actively managing community. So those communities who have professional staff with support from municipal officials, community forestry advocacy in some form, it could be an official group or a committee, whether they have a tree ordinance or policy, and within that tree ordinance or policy, who is responsible for the town's tree resources, tree inventory to accurately track species distribution, health, and maintenance, and then community forest management plans, which demonstrate a long-term commitment to the community forest resource within that location. Grant timeline, pretty straightforward. The RFP for grants was announced in January. We're doing the grant workshop today. March 22nd, the applications are due to MFS by 5 p.m. We are pretty strict with that. And then ideally, if our review goes as planned, we will have those award notifications out to you by the beginning of May. The intent there being that hopefully, particularly for those organizations who are planting, that you will have a narrow but somewhat of an opportunity to do that planting this spring if you're all ready to go. And again, work may only begin once that agreement's been signed, and that has to be signed by both parties. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on each of the different grant categories and run through the applications at this point. So the planting and maintenance grant category is the more basic grant category. It's geared towards applicants who may just be getting started in managing their community tree resources. These grants provide an excellent opportunity for communities to increase tree cover, improve tree health, and engage citizens and build support for their community tree program. Some examples of types of projects that can be included in this category would be tree planting in high visibility areas where they make a direct and positive impact on the community. Buffer plantings to filter air and water or limit stormwater runoff and stabilize soils. And business district enhancements. Another example that was added to the guidelines this year would be the establishment of a local tree nursery. One of the things that we're running into is a limited availability of nursery stock, both in quality and selection. And a number of communities are looking to establish their own community tree nurseries. So that would be something that you would apply for under this grant category. And then the planning and education grants support projects that develop and maintain managed long-term community forestry programs. Again, examples include things like street tree inventory, long-term planning, tree board and tree ordinance development, and forest management planning for publicly owned or accessible parcels. And those plans need to be in accordance with the Maine Forest Service WoodsWise standards, which is a complementary program that supports forest management planning on private parcels. If you have any questions about your project ideas, I encourage you to reach out to us and discuss your project ideas. I might encourage you to start with your district forester or with Kim, only because I'm very busy right now. I also try to stay as impartial about these projects as possible so that I can evaluate them with impartiality. Okay, so the application form, pretty straightforward. This one's going to look a little bit different than the one you see online, which is a fillable PDF. But this is the cover sheet for the planning and education grant category. And at the top there, you just need to complete your basic community or organizational information, how to contact you, include phone numbers and emails so that we can reach you if you have any questions. Summary of your budget. And I just make a note there that these need to match up with the more expanded budget on page 5 and the totals. And then a quick project abstract. This is not your narrative. You'll have another place to go into more detail about your project, but just provide us with a quick snapshot with some of the details, or with the overall project goals and objectives, not the details. This is the cover sheet for the planting and maintenance application. It's a little bit more simplified, again, recognizing that these are not as involved projects. So your community organizational information is just up there at the top, and then your budget is right there on that cover sheet with it. Second page for both applications outlines all of the additional information that you need to include with your application form. And that includes the project narrative, any maintenance plans for planting. You can include maps and photos of planting areas or project areas, and then letters of support from partnering organizations. Applications must be signed by both the applicant and the official representative of your organization. And that could be your town manager, your head select person, executive director, who be it. But it needs to be signed, in other words, by the person who is able to accept and expend funding. So the budget for planning and education, you have 7 categories for spending: consultants and services, educational promotional supplies, trees, planting and maintenance are also allowed under the planning and education grants. Column A is for your reimbursable expenses. Column B is for your non-reimbursable match. And then column C is the total of the two. I want to just point out here that you do not need to match 50-50 line item for line item. You can place all of your reimbursable costs in consultants and services and trees, and then later on here include all of your match under your local organizational costs, your community volunteers or your organizational staff who cannot be included as part of the reimbursable costs. So page 2 of that planning and education budget is strictly for those items which are non-reimbursable. That includes volunteer labor, donated materials, town staff, etc. None of those things are eligible for reimbursement, but they are definitely encouraged as part of the local match. You need to establish rates for each. For town staff, you want to use your normal hourly rates, your fully encumbered hourly rates. For volunteers, you can use established rates for services through a number of different entities. The State Bureau of Labor Statistics, State Department of Labor, or the independent sector volunteer rate, which I looked up the other day. And as of 2021, the independent sector volunteer rate for Maine was $26.77 per hour. So, but it's important to note there, if you're using whatever rate you use, it needs to be consistent across not just this program, but all other grants as well. So you don't want to use a different rate for the same person for providing the same service under a different grant than what you would do here. That is something that is a red flag for auditors. And then last page of the budget, any other costs that might not fit into those other categories. You want to tally up all of your reimbursable costs, all of your non-reimbursable match, and then a grand total of those. And those are the numbers that should match those grant totals on the front page. So for planting and maintenance, again, a little bit more of a simplified budget. You're limited to purchase of trees, planting costs, and maintenance costs, and any of those associated expenses for supplies and materials. The column on the left is for your reimbursable expenses, and on the right is your non-reimbursable match. And then onto the other things that you need to include with your grant package. The narrative is your story. It's the place where you're going to sell us on what it is that you want to do. Along with your application, the narrative is the most important element of your proposal. In it, you want to provide as much detail about what it is you hope to accomplish, including what you expect to be developed, produced, performed, or implemented. You should provide a work plan and a timeline for completion. You also want to explain how what you expect to do helps us reach our goals of developing sustainable urban and community forestry programs across the state, in particular in your community. How this will help you manage the community tree resource, make the public more aware of the benefits of trees, and how you will work with partners. You should also address how this project will enhance your ability to move towards that actively managing status, which I spoke about at the beginning. It's important to note, you're not evaluated on already being actively managing. You do not need to possess any of those elements that we report on, but it is the hope that with the support of a grant that a community would begin to move along that path of achieving some of those standards. And in the chat, I saw a comment pop up asking whether or not this will be available. The slides as well as the recording will both be available, yes. And we will put those up afterwards. So additionally, maps, photos, and other visuals help to tell that story in your narrative. I highly recommend that you include maps of tree planting locations, addresses, and photographs of those areas, demonstrating the need for planting trees in these spaces. The 3-year maintenance plan, if you're including any tree planting, is a critical piece of our evaluation. You want to identify in that 3-year maintenance plan individuals and resources that are responsible for tree maintenance over the 3-year period following planting. Again, though, it is important to note that only the costs of maintenance during the grant period are eligible for reimbursement or eligible as part of your local match. With that 3-year maintenance plan, you want to include a letter of support if those individuals or organization responsible for the maintenance is someone outside of you or your organization. Letters of support, applications with a broad range of support will be favored in our review. Any organizations that you're partnering with to help you achieve your goals should include a letter of support. And these letters of support should be specific commitments and contributions to the project rather than just general statements of support. We do receive a number of applications that have, letters from the local elected official's office. Those are wonderful. And, it's not that those are discouraged in any way, but those are not necessarily outlining any specific commitments towards your project goals. So make sure that you include letters of support that are specific in outlining things like the amount of labor that they've committed, estimated services, any donated equipment, supplies, or labor. And again, it is included in your application as well, that community capacity checklist, which outlines which of those elements your organization already has achieved towards becoming an actively managing community. Whether you have an inventory management plan already, professional tree care staff, tree care ordinance, and if you have a local advocacy or advisory organization for your community trees. And by filling this out, it also helps us with our record keeping and our reporting to the federal government. So thank you. And I'm going to hand off here. Before I do, some final suggestions. Just apologies there. I missed changing that date. That date should read March 22nd at 5 p.m. Make sure you make that deadline. As I said earlier, I'm pretty strict with that. Everything is electronically submitted. The forms are all Adobe PDF fillable forms. So you want to email everything direct to me. And I should say there too, I will send an acknowledgement when I receive your application. So if you do not receive an acknowledgement, please reach out separately, phone, email, however, until you do receive acknowledgement. Sometimes our state system bumps these things into our junk folders or elsewhere, and I may not see it right away. Of course, everything's date stamped, so if that happens, that's okay. But it would help if I don't receive it in my regular mailbox to know that it's lingering out there somewhere. So give me a shout. You want to make sure in filling out your application and doing your budget that you're doing your homework. Make sure you involve the community and proper authorities within the community. You don't want to be operating outside of any allowable space. And call with questions. We're happy to try to answer as many project-specific questions as possible. So I see Kim's kind of monitoring the chat. I think, Kim, if you wanted to, you could pipe up with any questions that I might want to answer before we move on to Marlene's section, which digs much more into the grants, the rules.
I think the only one I think that might be good to expound upon a little bit is, are we eligible if we don't have an official community forest program? Which, I mentioned if you're a nonprofit, municipality, or school, you're eligible. And you mentioned how work needs to be done on public accessing land. I don't know if you want to expand a little bit about the eligibility.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I guess I would want to know what you mean by official community forest program. I mean, there are many communities, and I use that term community loosely, to cover all of the entities that are, on paper eligible. And those would be, again, the municipalities, any level of state, local, or county government, land trusts or other nonprofits, and educational institutions. And again, educational institutions can take a much broader view here in Maine as well. So if you're eligible as one of those entities and you do not yet have a community forestry program, this is step one. Yeah, you're eligible. I'd be curious to know what it is that you want to do and what that first step is. But those are, those are things that we want to see happening across the state. And so I would say yes. But if you have questions about what an official community forest program is or what that means to you, or you want to explain that give us a shout. And we can open up the lines at the end if we want to allow for people to ask those questions, so everybody else can hear as well. So yeah, if anybody else has questions and they want to pop them in the chat before we hand off to Marlene, we can do that. I wanted to just put up some pretty pictures before we get into the grant do's and don'ts and start talking about responsibility and financial management of these grants. It's important to remind you, and it's also important to remind ourselves why this program is available. Its intent is to plant and grow the urban and community forest so trees become real community assets. So, some nice pictures of a big sugar maple and a pin oak that have been there for, over 100 years. This program is also to develop natural areas and town forests for recreation, for wildlife habitat, for improved water quality, and also for timber harvesting in some instances. It's to keep our community woodlands actively managed and open to the public, and to teach about the importance of these resources to our residents, our visitors, our children, and anybody who visits these spaces. And perhaps most importantly, this program is about fostering relationships and encouraging participation in the care of our natural resources within our communities and across the landscape. It's incredibly rewarding to work with all of you in seeing your project goals achieved, in planting trees, in managing our community forest resources. It's with working with these engaged groups that really brings me tremendous amount of joy. And we are here to help you achieve what it is that you want to do when it comes to your community tree and forest resources. So again, I am the grant manager, and sometimes I have to be strict with deadlines and financial stuff, but ideally, we're here to help. And So just reach out to us. So I'm going to hand over to Marlene now. You ready?
Yes.
Yay.
Computer
All
slow.
right.
All right. So I will be covering the grant rules of the road, and these are some of the topics that we'll review. Umbrellas of authority, which is some of the where's the federal guidelines, what we follow, right on down from the federal government, local government, and to the Maine Forest Service. We'll review financial management, match documentation, things to be concerned about around audits, grant modifications, procuring supplies or other items, and reporting monitoring. So this will cover some awareness for you. These might be things you are already aware of if you've participated in this grant or other grants. So it could be a review, but generally a lot of these grant rules apply to most grants. And so just like Jan mentioned before, if you have questions, be happy to answer them at the end and help people with what they might have questions on. So some of the things Jan already mentioned about the grant, but I'll go into some of it a little bit further. All right, these are some of the questions that we'll try to answer that you might wonder about, what your grant can be used for, the rules, the deadlines, record keeping requirements, match. For the Urban and Community Forestry Program, the CAFTA number is 10.675. Some may already know that. All right, moving on. These are just some terms that you may see related to grants. Pretty basic ones. Some of the key ones are making sure that your grant expenses are reasonable, allowable, that we're not committing fraud, waste, or abuse, and that we're being compliant with the grant funds you'll receive. Some acronyms. Some of these you may see more often than others. The Dun and Bradstreet, that related to having a DUNS number. Now, last April, we switched to having a UEI number, a unified number. So if you need that, there are places to get that number. So that was a slight change, but if you see the Dun and Bradstreet number, that's what it relates to, and now it's been replaced. But CFR, that's the Code of Federal Regulations that some of these rules are derived from, UCF, Urban and Community Forestry. So these are here for you to refer to if needed. And this is 2 CFR Part 200. That website has some of the rules should you want to go further into looking those up. It reviews the requirements, the cost principles, things about audits with your federal award, making sure that you're following the expectations. There are these, the federal level is pretty standard with those must be followed, but again, going on down to the different levels of government or organizations, there could be more rules or more restrictions that you also have to pay attention to. So these are just guidelines to keep people out of trouble, to make sure we're doing the right things with the funds. So what's included? These are just some of the sections from administrative requirements, cost principles, audit requirements, and data collection requirements. it's organized into different subparts. Subparts B through D talk about the administrative requirements for grant and cooperative agreements. And subpart E talks about determining allowable costs. And then F talks about the audit requirements. So it's just how it's organized. And it's just covering to make sure everyone's consistent with their grants and making sure that you stay within those guidelines. If there are any conflicts of interest, that needs to be disclosed in writing, just to make sure that there won't be any issues later on with the grant. So if there's any questions about that, please let us know. This is talking about the awarding agency reviewing any risk of the applicant. So when you submit your application, in addition to looking for making sure all the qualifications are met and that you're doing great things in the community to support Project Canopy, we also want to make sure that any organizations have the financial stability, have a management system to process their contracts or invoices, and that there's a way to track reports and effectively manage these grant funds. This is tracking performance and program activities, financial tracking, internal controls. This is all part of subpart D. So we'll go into some more details in some of these areas. A lot of outlining of some of these federal rules from the CFR. So moving on. So as grantees, these are some things that you would be responsible for. And that's to make sure you have accurate, current, and complete documentation of your grant activities for any expenses or match, all those things that Jan already mentioned earlier. That you keep good records to identify the source of any funding used related to the grant that you're working on, and any other sub-grant awards or authorizations and obligations. You want to have a tracking of where all of the funds come from and how they're spent, basically leaving a trail for any audits, or if there's any questions about anything, your expenses, you want to be able to show how things were spent and where they came from. There's 7 primary characteristics. You need to be able to identify the funds received and expended and keep complete financial records. Identify the source of your funding because you might get funds from other areas. So you need to be able to track those separately and have effective controls and accountability. Know how they're spent. So if you do have a pot of money, making sure you know how much was spent in this particular grant versus another grant. You want to be able to compare your budget to actuals. That will help you to track, are you spending within what was approved for your grant or over, or just making sure it's current with those budget categories. And you need to follow your own written procedures for your agency for processing payments and for any other administrative process in setting up, it could be volunteers, contracts. That's what an auditor would look for, is that you're following your own procedures. For financial management systems, it should have internal controls. That's making sure the segregation of duties not all functions should be performed by one person. So if you have a director that's approving all of the contracts and approving all of the expenses, that might be an issue. So you want to make sure there's different people involved that have different responsibilities. You should have a way to track expenses in different accounts. If you're in a town, you have different accounts, be able to pull the information to see what was spent on the particular grant or what's remaining in the account, compliance with your cash management, tracking your budget and expenses, and ensuring that your costs related to the grant are allowable, related to the specific grant. So having checks and balances is important, but also leaving a clear audit trail. You need to be able to track all your federal awards, as I mentioned before, of everything received and expended, so that you know how much was spent in each grant. And when doing this, it's good if you can track the CFDA number, title and number, but also the federal award identification number and year. We do this Project Canopy grant every year, so you might have funds from last year you're still expending, and then maybe a new award happens this year, so you would want to track those numbers by the year and the Project Canopy grant identification number. That will help track the separate grant expenses. Also, if you have different awards from other federal agencies, that's important to also keep track of. And any other pass-through grants that you might have. It's also, if you do have prior year money, it's good to try to spend those first, because those will expire more quickly. And then as you get new funds, then you can use the new funds in the new grant. Just important to keep track of the dates and make sure that the timing is accurate before any grant expires. This is a blank form that is used for tracking grant expenses. This can be used, I believe we have copies that can be provided, but you can use anything similar that you may already have in your organization. It tracks the date, name, description, or things like volunteers or staff. It has the rate per hour, total expenses, and then any match, which is direct match or in-kind match. It just highlights some of the data that you should be tracking. But again, you can use anything you might already have in your agency.
Marlene, I want to just pop in here for a second and say, as the program is managing more and more grants all the time, and we'll be managing even more in the future, it's my intent that we're probably going to make this more of an automated and formulated system. So I recognize that municipalities and a lot of organizations do have their own internal practices, and those will still be, you'll be able to use those and upload those for our system. But for those of you who don't have a system in place for grant tracking, let's talk, because I want to make sure that we're building something that's going to work for everybody, but it makes it a lot easier on our end for review and as well as for reimbursement if we're using the same formats. So we're going to be working in the next few months to come out with a more robust and simplified consistent form for everybody to use. So be on the lookout for that, and it would be in place before any of you would have a need to be tracking anything. So just wanted to say that.
Thanks, Jan. Yes, that is a great idea and would make things more consistent and simple. This is just a sample of one that's filled out, like the blank one we just showed you. And like Jan had mentioned before, in column H, it has direct grant expenses, and then in the next column I it has in kind. So they don't all have to be line for line, but it's just the totals at the bottom need to add up. These are samples of some different spreadsheets used to track volunteer time or salaried employees, and also the value of donated equipment, which again should be the fair market value. It's just a way to capture that data, especially as you use it. If you are, um, if you do get something like that in place and it's donated, then it would be what would it cost if you did have to purchase that or pay the rental fee. So these again are probably forms we can make available if needed, or if you have some in your agency already. It's very important to track all the details related to your grant as you go. Make sure that you have it for your audit trail and to be able to get reimbursed.
I'll just pipe in again too and say, I mean, yeah, you don't need to use these forms, but when it comes to working with volunteers or folks outside of your organization, to have a tracking mechanism for their time is very important, and having them sign off on that as well, or somebody who is representative of that organization, having them sign off on it. When I go through these reimbursement packets, that's what I'm looking for, is signatures to of somebody who's taken ownership of the fact that this information is true.
Allowable costs, these should be necessary for your grant, reasonable, and allocable, meaning it's something that you would spend on your grant activities, and chargeable, and consistency. You don't want to shift the cost around. You want to keep it anything related to the grant consistent. Any rates applied to other grants, apply it to this grant as well. And you want to follow your written procedures for allowability of cost and follow the cost principles from subpart E of the CFR. Unallowable costs, if you have any costs that are related to other things that don't have anything to do with the grant, those would not be allowed. Or if any costs happened before the grant was awarded or after the grant period closed, those would not be able to be used, including match. If you don't have adequate documentation, it could be those volunteer hours or some donated equipment or time, and that's not documented or signed, that also could be an issue where it might not be able to be used. Or maybe it wasn't included in your grant of what you said you would do, or there's not enough match. Maybe you didn't have enough to match that 50-50 for this particular grant. So it's important that everything that's noted in your narrative that you say you're going to do, that's what the expenses are related to, and that it's within the grant period and properly documented. You should have effective internal controls. I mentioned this earlier as well. And that's that segregation of duties, making sure you have a good system of tracking expenses and separate grant awards from different agencies if you have more than one. You want to follow any compliance rules that you or any federal agencies might have. If there are any issues with non-compliance, those should be communicated immediately, and documentation of what happened and corrective actions taken. So things happen, but the sooner that it's identified and communicated, then maybe there's a plan to help resolve the issue and get back on track. So that needs to just be an upfront thing if anything happens that wasn't in compliance. Any PII needs to be treated appropriately for the requirements around PII. And again, you just need to follow all of your agency rules and policies and procedures. More on internal controls. You don't want to have any pre-signed checks if you're dealing with checks. Any amounts, certain expenses over a certain amount requires 2 signatures. So if that's what your agency has for requirement, then you need to follow that. Signature stamps are not a good thing to use. So if you're signing your reimbursement request, try not to use the signature stamps. If you're making a payment, you should review the invoice and checks and any supporting documentation to make sure there's enough there for you to submit for reimbursement. And anything in your agency that has a system of reviewing signatures or approvals for checks and invoices, that should also be used. And again, financial director usually would not be the same person signing the check. If they're the person signing your agreements or grant proposals, then having a system of checks and balances where there's separation of duties and somebody else is signing the invoice is better. If you are a small agency with only 1 or 2 people, then maybe we would need to talk to you about how that could work. But most of the agencies we work with have more people, so let us know if there's any issues around that. Matching and cost sharing. This must be verifiable using an accounting system to assign those identifiers, identify the different grants as you're receiving grant awards and spending money. You should have a good tracking system. Federal grants cannot be used as match for another federal grant. That's a usual standard, but there are exceptions. So don't assume that if you have other federal funds that can be used as match. So you want to note the source of your match so that we know it's not from a federal grant. Or if you have questions around that, then we can look at possible exceptions, but it's pretty small usually.
Yeah, I
Program.
would know that of any entities that are on other federal funds and looking to use those as match. I've yet to find an exception. That's not to discourage you, but that's been my experience.
Yep. And out of all, I mean, I've worked with a number of different grant programs and I only know of one. So, so yeah, don't assume that. Just plan for other sources for your match. Program income may not be used for cost sharing or match without prior approval. In-kind contributions can be part of your match, but that needs to be documented with details, like we had mentioned in those other slides with donated equipment and volunteer hours. Without that documentation, it's really hard to use the in-kind as match. But if you have the documentation, then definitely. Again, the Urban Community Forestry Program is a 50-50 match reimbursement program. So once you spend your funds, you would get reimbursed the 50% with appropriate documentation. And the total cost of your project will include the federal amount and your match, as Jan reviewed on the application documents. Everything that relates to the expenses for this grant should be necessary to support the grant and reasonable to accomplish. A little bit more on donations. Jan had mentioned already, for volunteer hours, you can get those from a couple sources, including the Bureau of Labor Standards, or maybe it's a similar cost to what it would take to hire somebody. And it would need to be consistent for what you would pay for similar work. Consistent with this grant and across all your grants. If there's any donated property, this might not apply to this grant, but if there is, then it would be the value assessed at the time of the donation, and it would not exceed the fair market value. So if there's any questions on donations, please reach out. In-kind contributions is it's non-cash. It might not be a direct expense, but it could be included if it was important or critical in getting your grant accomplished and also was documented. So it must be allowable under the grant and within reason. And you need to have it keep it in your records, but you probably also need to submit it to get reimbursed. So those are very important because maybe you have a hard time getting the complete cash match from maybe your own employee salaries or some other contract you might be paying for. In-kind contributions can really help get you to that 50%, as long as you're tracking all of the documentation and keeping it within reason and following all those guidelines we've provided. Program income. These can defray the costs of the program where appropriate, but it must be from a grant-supported activity, cannot be from taxes, fines, or penalties. But you need prior written approval to use this. So if this is something that you're trying to include, then reach out for this as well. Audits, anytime you have a grant award, there's always that possibility you could have an audit and you want to be in compliance and not have to pay any fines. So it's important to leave a good audit trail, including all documentation around the grant. This mentions some of the circular A133 for state, local governments, and nonprofit organizations for subpart F. All of these agencies, if you have more than 750,000 in one fiscal year, then that's the expenditure threshold. If that's the case, then reach out. We'll take a look. This is usually not the case for this grant, but we can look at that. You have a responsibility to notify us of any audit findings, should you have an audit. What do they look for? They're looking to see that costs that you had expended are eligible under your grant. They were related to what you said you would do. If you had submitted a grant for tree plantings and you had a cost for tree plantings, then that would meet the audit requirements. But if you started paying for other things, then that's where it wouldn't. Are they reasonable? Were they within the cost of what you would normally pay for without the grant? Are they within the grant dates? If you receive federal funds, they need to be within that grant period. Or was another federal grant program used? You want to be careful about that to make sure no other federal funds are used with this particular grant. And you have the proper documentation. And are you consistent across your grant programs? These days, we keep track of our files electronically. We did have some paper files. Either way, you can still keep record of all of these important documents from your application, notice of award, any documentation of review, or it could even be some emails or recommendations. Any of your written policies related to this, you would at least want those readily available, even if you keep them separate from the grant file. Any expenses related to the grant, again, if you have that tracking sheet of your expenses, that makes it easy. But if you had any copies of those specific invoices, it's also good to keep with the grant file. Any related match that's related to the grant, and any closeouts and any reports, any of those documentations, good to keep with the grant file. It keeps it all together and easy for review or to answer any questions. This was a format we used in the Maine Forest Service for keeping paper copies. Basically, now we just keep track of it electronically in somewhat similar folders on the server. But this is including anything related to the grant that includes correspondence, your forms, application, progress or monitoring reports, and your final reports. So this is, again, just a format we used before. So in case you use paper files, you could set it up like this if you wanted. Your narrative statement, as Jan mentioned, your sales pitch, it's your opportunity to explain what your goals and objectives are and describe how you're going to get those done, which partners you might work with, your timeline, how you're going to monitor and evaluate your results. It also includes your budget, how you're going to spend your funds. It should not include equipment or anything over $5,000 for one single item of equipment. Equipment definition is considered a tangible personal property, which has a useful life of more than 1 year, costs more than $5,000. And again, this is not authorized under Project Canopy. So this wouldn't be the grant to use if you wanted to buy a piece of equipment to remove trees or a chipper or something like that. That would not be allowed here. I don't think we've had an issue with that, but we're just mentioning it to make sure.
We've definitely had people want to buy chippers before.
Oh, okay.
So
Well,
no chippers.
no
The
chippers.
one that most often we deal with is watering tanks and trailers, and if it's under 5,000, it can be allowed.
Okay.
But that's a stretch with the cost of things these days.
Yes. Yep. So this wouldn't be the grant. There may be other grants, but not this one. Standards for documenting your work performed. You want to track the details of the work performed that are related to this grant, any of the employees that might have worked on it, both the federal funds used and non-federal funds or activities, any salary, wages, or if someone's working on more than one federal grant, you want to have a tracking system that shows which hours they worked on this grant versus another grant. Maybe you have something in your payroll system that allows you to select a task, or maybe it's a spreadsheet, but it's important to track so that you don't double count those hours anywhere else in any federal grant, and that the time spent on the grant is accurate. And budget estimates cannot be used. It needs to be actual expenses. The budget can help you relate to, are you on track within the budget amount that you had planned for? But in order to get reimbursed and have your match count, you want to be able to track your hours and make sure it's not conflicting with any other grants. Funds can be moved between budget categories, but requires written approval from the Maine Forest Service. Uh, so there are times you might have unanticipated requirements or something changes. I mean, one example could have been the whole COVID time. Things were delayed and we couldn't do things on the timeline we expected. So if that's the case, then you need to reach out and have an explanation for what the reason is and what the revision includes. And then we would have to review that individually to make sure it would be acceptable. But there are times when this could happen. So if that happens, please reach out. Again, for amending any particular grant, you need to request permission first. Without that, I'm not sure that you would be able to get reimbursed. So please remember to reach out first if something changes. And as you're preparing your budgets and narratives, it's all based on your best estimate at the time. And if you need to change it or revise it later, then make sure you request prior approval. The changes could occur in your scope or goals, or maybe somebody left your agency, now you have a new person, and maybe we would need to change who the primary contact is, or even the timeline, or adding or subtracting something that you had already planned to do in your grant. That would all need to be documented and requested prior to the end date of your grant. So if any of those situations happen, please reach out prior to the end of your grant and we'll work with you on what it is that needs to be changed and how we might be able to help get that back on track. Some of the budget changes include transfers between budget categories. This could be maybe you were going to do a contract, but now you're not, and you're just going to buy supplies, something to that nature. Those budget changes would also need to be requested prior to the end of a grant, and we'd work with you on that. Or it could be a change in match, what you were counting as match, or in any changes to your overhead and direct costs. So if any of those things happen, then we also would need to review that prior to you spending the funds or before the end of the grant. Revisions and it also includes grant extensions. If you need a little more time because of some unplanned circumstance, it's the same category, needs prior approval. Any of your revisions, though, should still meet the same program intent for Project Canopy. It still should be related to what's required in any Project Canopy grant. So any of these project modifications, you should also include a strong justification and then request the approval. Procurement, you should follow your own written procurement procedures within your agency. That is exactly what auditors would look for as well. You should also follow any state or local laws and regulations, or for your town or whatever government structure you're part of. And any supplies that you purchase with your intending to be reimbursed with the grant funds should be necessary to support the grant. It should be a reasonable amount of cost and should have documentation for it. And if there are any conflicts, then that should be also documented. Basically, you just want to follow your own procurement procedures, making sure it's within the grant rules, that it's needed for the grant, not excessive, and that you follow a competitive process if the same way you would for any other supplies you would purchase for your agency. Competition, small purchases still need to follow the same type of open competition rules. They should be reasonable. Um, if it is required that you get quotes, then you would do that for this grant as well. It is discouraged to use sole source whenever possible, unless there is an emergency or a uniqueness about that purchase. So basically, this is just covering that you want to try to be consistent with the way you purchase supplies in your agency, open competitive market, and make sure it's something needed for the grant. Monitoring and reporting. You are responsible for keeping track of that documentation of all your activities related to this grant, and be able to report at the end everything that you had for a goal. Was it met? What things were done to support what you had written in your narrative, achievement of all of those goals. And it needs to be submitted in the timely manner required by the grant, and should include the financial details involved from your budget. So if you kept your tracking spreadsheet of expenses, you could include that and highlight in your report what was spent and how that met your goals for this grant. And then the grant report should be signed that, to the best of your knowledge, that the data included is true, accurate, complete. It was related to the grant and that there was no fraud or misuse of federal funds. And that's, again, Jan mentioned she's looking for those signatures in some of those forms that are submitted, including any of those match or in-kind documentation. So make sure to sign any of those reports. Financial monitoring, just keep track of all your documentation for expenses related to this grant, any receipts or contracts, purchase orders. Maybe somebody had to travel, maybe it was the vehicle mileage, and you tracked that going back and forth to the site. Your payroll, if your system for payroll doesn't track it automatically, then you'll need to track that separately for the hours worked on the grant. So any expenses, please keep documentation for all of it. And using those tracking spreadsheets, again, is a good tool. Again, you want to follow your local and state and even your own agency written policies for procurement, for your payroll, for any purchases or contracts. If you do end up using any sole source, you want to have the justification for why you had to use that sole source, and you want to document any conflicts of interest. And this just helps you track the details related to your grant. If you have any subrecipients or contractors, you want to make sure that there's compliance with the grant for those as well. It's a good idea to have site visits and frequent phone conversations to make sure that things are on track, that what's expected is getting done and according to how you had planned. Maybe you want to have written progress reports from subrecipients or contractors, or updates on news stories, and so that you are getting what you expected for and what you're paying for them to do. And also making sure it happens within the grant period. Benefits to monitoring um, any subrecipients is you can provide technical assistance, or you can showcase any successes. Sometimes pictures are great, and you can ensure projects are on track, or even improve communication on what is expected or more things that you'd like to see done, or correct shortfalls and offer solutions. So as far as fiscal matters, here's some areas to proceed with caution. Supplantation, that's being careful not to divert any budgeted funds for a specific project to some other expense. Once you've received your grant approval, you want to keep it within that particular grant that you were approved for, specifically for those expenses. So if you got a grant award and then decided, oh, I think I'll just use the extra funds over here on this other project, that would not be allowed. Um, Consultants, making sure that fair market values are used. For program income, that we just would make sure it's within the scope of what was in your grant application. Match, making sure there's documentation that you have enough of it, or again, if it's in kind, that you've got those signatures and details. If there's excessive spending near the end of a grant period, sometimes that can raise some questions. In this case, you're paying for everything up front and then requesting reimbursement, so it's slightly different, but there are times when that would raise some questions. And again, keeping track of your records is also very important. Retention applies to all your financial and program records, supporting documentation, any work done with grantees or subgrantees. You want to keep any files related to this grant for 3 years after the close of the grant, which is the date of submission of the final expense report. So keep those files for 3 years, whether they're electronic or paper or both. And then after the 3 years, you can follow your own retention policies for how you maybe remove those. Civil rights and credits. The USDA is prohibited from discrimination, so we want to follow all the civil rights contained here. There's a website, so that we're not discriminating to any race, color, national origin, sex, age, disability, any of those. Let us know if you have questions on that.
Yeah, I would just add in, this is included mainly if you're producing any written, publication or any signage, anything like that, and making sure that you're including that civil rights inclusion statement on any of that, to make sure that we're covering ourselves. So.
Just a summary here of what we're looking for as far as the grant is making sure that your project is lined up with your goals. Any expenses should support those, the plan and your narrative and your goals and objectives. Any approved initiatives and investments, any cost analysis. So looking at the expenses should relate to what you had planned for in your budget for the most part and what you had said in the narrative, that any of the expenses are necessary, reasonable, appropriate, and that you have uh, prior approval for things, including subrecipients. So just a lot of documentation and making sure it's in track with what you said you would do. These are our contact information for Jan and myself. And again, they mentioned the slideshow and presentation will be made available. So if you have any questions on the grant details or anything related to this grant, please let us know. And these are some of the OMB circulars, USDA regulations, and Code of Federal Regulations. So if you're curious about any of those details, please go to these websites to learn more.
And especially if you're having trouble sleeping at night,
Yes.
dig into some of those. Really a good, heavy technical information there. So that's it. That's all 80 slides. I want to open it up, I think, at this point. If anybody wants to type questions into the chat, they can do that. You can raise your hand and I can unmute you. I think that's probably the way to go versus unmuting everybody. But we have still 30 minutes left on our scheduled time for this program. So now's a good time to ask your questions. I also want to add to, I see in the list of attendees, some of you are not listed under your name. I think I should be able to match everything up with the registrations, but if you're listed as just guest or not identifiable by your name, if you would please just type your name into the chat so that we know that you were here. Thank you, Alex. Hi, Karen. Anything in the chat, Kim, that you see that we should talk about just generally?
Not really. There were very little questions and no, I think we're in good shape.
Yeah, Yvette did ask a question about the Community Resilience Partnership Program with GoPIF. And just the use of other state funds. And yes, those are most definitely allowed and encouraged as part of your local match. So we do have a hand. Dewey, I'll unmute you, Dewey. I think, yes. Dewey, can you try your mic? I might need technical help, Greg, if you're around. I don't know, maybe I can't unmute you, Dewey. You might have to type. Yeah, I've done what I can, Dewey, to try to unmute you. So having trouble there. Kim, you can try to. I know you're an organizer.
I was looking, and all I can do is disable his mic, so that's not good.
Yeah, well, because I enabled it.
If he can unmute himself by any chance?
Yeah, Dewey, if you try to unmute yourself, and that we do have a question in the chat. Let's see, I think. Would this grant cover surfacing a woods trail to make it handicapped accessible? I would suggest that that's not the intent of this program. There are other programs that are available within the Department of Ag, Conservation and Forestry that would be more appropriate to that type of activity. If it was a small area and it was part of a larger project that was more related to the program, I could see including it perhaps, but otherwise, Marlene, you might know better if like the recreational trails program, or I don't think LWCF would be applied here, but I think probably recreational trails would be the more appropriate.
That could, yes, especially a woods trail.
Okay, yeah. So I would encourage you, Joseph, to reach out to Doug Beck, who is the program coordinator for Recreational Trails Program. I just was on a call with Doug yesterday, and I believe they release the new program materials sometime later in the spring, and those are available starting in the fall. Okay, I'm going to try. Is that Anna or Ed? I'm allowing your mic. So if you want to try then to unmute yourself for the folks who have their hands raised.
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry, I'm under stewardship, but my name's Alex. I work for Island Heritage Trust. I was just curious. So the project I was looking at, we own a piece of property along a pond in Deer Isle, and it's a park lake. It has like gravel paths. You know, I wouldn't call it completely accessible, but it's nice. It's right next to a nursery, like a retirement home, so some of the folks there can walk the trails. And I guess my question is, there's a lot of different components that we could do on this property, but one is that there's a bunch of Norway maples that are invasive. And then there's a group of like ash trees and stuff. And on this like sector of woods that lines the pond, I was kind of hoping to turn into more resilient and sustainable forests, using some of our local arborists and stuff. And then also we own a field there, and one of the arborists suggested that we try to implement some sort of a nursery. If I combine the forest plan with the nursery, is that too much, or should I be more focused on just one or the other?
I mean, honestly, Alex, I think it's probably going to depend on the cost. I mean, the nursery itself could be fairly expensive, and I know it's going to be a labor-intensive endeavor. I would encourage you to I mean, just map them out, figure out what the costs are going to be separately. And I should have said also during the program, entities that want to apply under both categories can do that. You're not limited to one application. Typically, if the program is competitive and we are overextended on our funds, we would ask that you pick just one of those projects if the funds are a limiting factor. But that's up to you. I know, Alex, I think we spoke about the project that you have along the pond, and that definitely is something that is eligible and allowed. And then separately, the nursery would be as well.
Sure,
they're in coordination, and I can see that one is going to be feeding into the other, but think about how that would work, with the capacity that you have, and if you would be able to pull off both of those things within the same time frame. These grants are not going away. Our funding source from the federal government is stable, so you can expect that we would be offering these grants again next year. So if those things can be separated out, I think that's probably the more reasonable way to go.
Yeah. Well, it's don't want to get the cart before the horse here, but like, being a land trust, we inherit relationships with past, volunteers or just board members and stuff like that. And as people age out, we always receive these requests for like memorial trees or whatever. And just in the past, when I've tried to plant trees from nurseries, not all of them, sometimes it's hard to get them, established. So anyways, the concept is maybe establishing a memorial nursery so that we can propagate our own. Where I think that probably if we went that route, like we could receive support from just the organization for something like that. So anyway, I'm just trying. I don't want to again like make it too complex or whatever, but I was really excited when I heard you earlier say that nurseries were something that we were interested in. So
yeah, they are definitely becoming a more popular item to request funds for. So
I have one more question. Do you have any
Yep.
resources that like are state approved on nurseries, or is there something that you could point me to?
I would encourage you to call Kim.
Okay, great. Will do.
We don't have anything official on nurseries. I mean, it is very much based on what you have available there, and we're looking at different options for what communities can build as far as the infrastructure to support a nursery. And there are a number of different entities that have installed nurseries in the last couple of years. So there's lots of examples around too. So we can refer you to those as well.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Do you have a couple questions in the chat? So with the May 1st award notification from MFS would be against the grant details to order the tree supplies in advance to meet the deadline for spring planting, in addition to the FY ending of June 30th. No, because you haven't made any payment, Karen, on the trees, and I recognize that that's a typically by the time these grants are awarded, the nurseries are out of their planting stock, and you would be put in the position of having to sacrifice your desired planting list and make substitutions. So no, that's not against anything, as long as you have not paid anybody. So hopefully that answered your question, Karen. So, and then Leslie and I have spoken online about a project they have in Wiscasset, which is restoring a riparian area. And she's asking about plantings to include wetland plants and some small trees, if this would be a fit. And thank you for asking that in the chat, Leslie, because it's a good thing to outline for everybody. The intent of these grants is to plant ornamental and shade trees. That should be the focus of your any planting project. Shrubs can be allowed, woody shrubs, perennial grasses, any type of perennial plants cannot. And nothing that is not woody. That has been our stance historically, and what we've stuck with. It can be perennial plants, even annual plants as part of a complete project can be included as part of your local match, but could not be included as a reimbursable expense. And for projects, again, that are including shrubs, the majority of your project should not be in planting shrubs. It should be, the focus should be on the ornamental and shade trees. And Marlene has popped in Doug Beck's information for RTP. That's great. Great person to talk to. And don't see any other hands up other than Dewey's, and I still can't unmute you, Dewey. I'm sorry. Give me a call and we can answer questions. Any other questions in the chat? Not seeing anybody. Yeah, I would just, I'd refer you further to you can review the slides, you can review the program online, hopefully within a day or so. Typically, we have that edited and put up online. Review the guidelines. All of our contact information is in those guidelines, and you can call me, you can call Kim, you can call Marlene, or your district foresters with questions. I would say programmatic types of questions. You want to refer to one of us that's here on the program today. If you have project-related questions, I would very much encourage you to reach out to your district forester. They're there for you locally and often can become much more involved in your program and helping you to make it a success on the ground. They're just really good people to have in your corner. So with that, if there's nothing else, I think we will wrap up. And thank you all for your time. I know it's super dry material, but it's important stuff to cover before you get involved with doing one of these grants. So I look forward to seeing your proposals in another month or so.